Hello, everyone, and welcome to LIMA Online, and welcome to yet another special edition of LIMA Online. It's our second digital weird talk that we organize in very close collaboration with arebyte Gallery, and they're all here, the organizers of the show and of arebyte Gallery, and our guest of tonight, Jan-Robert Leegte, co-curator of the exhibition, Rebecca Edwards from arebyte Gallery, and Elvia Wilk, our honored guest. So yeah, I would say let's start this night, and maybe Jan-Robert, you can start by introducing the show to us. That is the starting point for all this.
Great, thanks so much for hosting this these two talks. About 1.5 years ago, we just sort of reconnaissanced. Nimrod and Rebecca invited me to curate a show with them. And sort of pretty instantly, I wanted to do something with the topic of the weird, and was interested if there was such a thing as a digital weird. And knew it from my own practice. I sort of felt intuitively where that could be, but it would be a nice thing to discover. We wanted to make a physical show, which ended up in an online show. It's a scavenger hunt of embedded works in the wild in different sort of platforms online. Feel free to go to arebyte, the website, to the digital weird page, and maybe we can post it, and you can enjoy the exhibition there. To provide some context, we organized 2 talks. A month ago, we talked to Eric Davis. Eric and Elvia both being very sort of provided sort of the discourse or the words to work with this material. It's something I've always been passionate about, but since Elvia and Eric have been really writing a lot, it's become a thing we can actually verbalize, which is weird. That is for tonight. So tonight we've invited Elvia. Rebecca will be in conversation with Elvia, and I can't wait. So let's get started.
Great, thank you. Hi everyone, my name is Rebecca Edwards. I'm the curator at arebyte Gallery. arebyte is a digital new media space based in East London, and we kind of represent multiple voices in digital culture, work with many different artists using many different technologies, new and old. So before we get into the weird and all of its facets, I'll first introduce our invited speaker tonight, Elvia Wilk. Elvia Wilk is a writer and editor living in New York. Her first novel, Oval, was published in June 2019 by Soft Skull Press, and a book of essays called Death by Landscape is forthcoming in 2022, which we're really excited for. She is a recipient of a 2019 Andy Warhol Arts Writers Grant and a 2020 fellowship at the Berggruen Institute. So yeah, thanks for joining us, Elvia. We're here tonight to talk about the weird and some of what that might encompass within the framework of our online exhibition titled The Digital Weird. I will just note that it runs until the 6th of September, so you all still have time to see it if you want to experience it. But essentially the exhibition came about through many conversations I had with the co-curator, Jan-Robert. We're both very much interested in this idea of the weird and how it comes into contact with ontology, but I guess also how it operates as a social thing. So the weird is this undefinable, unrelenting force that's kind of present in so many things from art, literature, language. And so tonight, I kind of hope that we can delve a little bit deeper with Elvia to unearth some other perspectives or shed some light on how the weird operates. One of the main driving forces behind the exhibition, Elvia, was actually your text for Literary Hub titled Toward a Theory of the New Weird. And in it, you kind of trace the lineage of the weird in writing from the old weird and its opposite, the new weird. So maybe we can start this conversation by telling us a little bit about that research and how you maybe come to undefine the new weird.
Thanks, and thanks for having me. It's really nice to be paired also with Eric, who was part of the last talk, because I think we have a lot of complementary things to say about the weird. I came to the idea of weirdness kind of sideways. I wrote a novel that some people called weird, and so I was naturally curious to follow that train of thought. And also some writers who I admire have been sort of flirting with these terms. New weirdness. Speculative fiction is really on the edge of these kind of categories. And I'm glad you said undefined, because it's hard to work with definitions when the very topic you're dealing with is the undefinable, often experienced beyond language, or trying to capture the ineffable using these like clumsy tools that we have as people, like story, for instance. And basically, I can just outline briefly the best book on the weird, or the best compendium that I've found is this book by Mark Fisher called The Weird and the Eerie. He uses these terms by, he defines them by walking through works of literature, art, movies, and music that express or act out the terms, as he says, which I do think is one of the best ways to do this. And he talks about weird as an outside space, that which does not belong, generally zones of experience and types of encounter that rupture the categories that we organize the world with. And we have no choice but to then basically say these categories fall short. And you can explain these experiences through drug trips, or dream states, or illnesses, mental illnesses, but ultimately what they point to is a kind of world beyond human experience. And so in terms of literary categories, just to kind of speed along, the new weird, it defines itself through a bunch of work that literary scholars and writers have done against a kind of weird fiction that emerged at the start of the 20th century, end of the 19th century. Lovecraft is the author who always comes up. He came back into popularity in the last decade or so. Yeah, H.P. Lovecraft, he wrote The Call of the Cthulhu, which is kind of this quintessential story about this tentacled squid-like creature who comes back from the depths of ancient time and overwhelms this main character, sort of destroying the concepts of reality that he lives by. New Weird, in my conception, has the potential to do something different rather than suggesting this scary outside zone to, for instance, Western male experience. It could offer alternatives for thinking about what is weird in the first place, how we draw those lines between normalcy and otherness, and help us question things down to the cellular level, so disrupting the category of humanity itself.
Yeah, I think within that text, there was so much that we took as reference points. And I think I would like to talk about some of them tonight, namely language or lack thereof to describe or undescribe. And also like the idea of the feminist lens and what that really means in like the new weird and new fiction, and maybe the new digital weird. Because I suppose one thing that you did sort of elaborate on in this text is this idea that there's this perceptual flip of seeing the inside of reality from the position of the outside. And I feel like that's also something we should definitely talk about in relation to the exhibition. But first, I kind of want to bring it right back and maybe take us back 2 decades to where this really also really began. So alongside your text, the exhibition takes inspiration from nostalgia of the early 90s sort of internet hunts, and this idea of finding clues or hints to explore different internet domains, or in our case, explore different works that have been uploaded to various sites of communication, you know, these kind of like community spaces. Some of them are old, so we used a lot of various platforms. Yeah, some of them are old, some of them are new, some of them are unknown. I didn't really know of a lot of them. We worked with a great guy called Sam who kind of helped us traverse this land a little bit. But yeah, as Jan Robert said, viewers kind of go through this exhibition by looking for hyperlinks to other sites that are embedded within the work. So of course, like within this, there are so many instances for a viewer to get lost. The links kind of present themselves, but only slightly present themselves, and other times are completely hidden, other times they're hidden in plain sight. So, you know, this was a very deliberate decision. You know, we actively wanted visitors to get lost along the way and to allow for their curiosity to take them down an internet rabbit hole. So, you know, the hyperlinks were really at the forefront of our thinking for this show, and you know, they're super important, obviously, but I think they were even more so important in those early days of the internet, because a site wasn't really complete without links to other sites. You know, it was like this very peer-to-peer network of building up information yourselves and kind of linking it via web rings or other methods. So, you know, links are one of the web's most defining features, but one that's in decline now, I guess, because of like the platform's attempt to recirculate users within their own walls, as it were. You know, everybody wants to keep people within the platforms to get as much content, sort of get as much advertisement as they can to their users. So so I guess thinking about the way that the exhibition is formatted and how many of the works kind of reference early internet graphics and early internet art, maybe you want to speak a little bit about this predilection for nostalgia, because I know that when we spoke on the phone, this was something that kind of excited you a little bit, like thinking about how nostalgia maybe is surfaced in your own writing and where that is in relation to the weird.
Yeah, I find this idea of nostalgia very fruitful, especially when thinking about the aesthetics that emerged from your exhibition making. And I think something about this format of like a sprawling, sort of ever-present, but maybe constantly changing network of links that can lead you to dead ends or lead you to unexpected places, maybe that aren't even part of the show. I think that it's interesting and curious that along with that, there emerged an aesthetic sensibility in many of the works that does reference earlier 0.0 versions of the web, whatever one we're in now, I'm not sure. For me, that suggests that to use the term digital weird seems appropriate, because these categories for how we think that the internet works and how even your browser and your desktop and your hardware work, that these are actually relatively recent constructs that we take for granted, and we rarely question them anymore. One reason I like to look at the early text-based internet of the early 90s, which was actually a really dynamic and exciting social space where people were role-playing and creating message boards and virtual worlds, and you could really do a lot with text commands, is that I completely forget in my daily life that the image-based internet was not available for a long time, and that imagery and the kind of accessibility or supposed transparency that imagery affords, the illusion of transparency and accessibility, is something that when the internet was first invented wasn't really on the table at that point. The anonymity that was allowed by text-based interfaces is very different from the kind of corporatized, commercialized internet that we have today, where if you're anonymous, you're assumed to be a creep or a bully or a hacker, not that you are experimenting with identity play. And, you know, a lot of artists, I think, in the exhibition are working through visual means to question this kind of pinning of self to identity or performed self online, and trying to explore that gap between the body and the self as performed online. So I don't think it's a coincidence that there are a lot of like odd explorations of embodiment in the show, because that gap, again, is kind of where weirdness lives, where the construct that we find on the internet and assume is the way things are, is actually very constructed and with very deliberate goals in mind by a certain small group of people. So disrupting those expectations, the monetization of performance, of self, the extremely rigid platforms for communication we have that in general prioritize imagery as much as I prefer Twitter. I mean, I can't say that it's not itself a designed image-based interface. So anyway, I think weirdness resides in that gap between the body and the performance of self, and sort of highlighting the fact that there's actually a real opacity there rather than a transparency.
Yeah. I mean, that kind of I guess there is kind of a notion in maybe like body horror, or viewing the body as a certain other kind of weirdness, like an appendage maybe that's unrelated to your mental being. And I think one of the works that shows this really well is Digital Excreta's work in the show. So this is like, there's a couple of works, there's a still and there's a video as well, but these are where the augmented vision of reality is kind of simultaneously strengthened and transfigured via this understanding that the internet allows us to envision a new version of ourselves, right? So it's like this untethered version that's not related to a physical state, and I think that is very important. I think it kind of links to what you were saying about opacity and kind of transparency of identity as well. But maybe we can take a look at Digital's work, Jose, if you've got them ready. Spell check. Let's go with spell check. Cool, thank you. And I guess I'd also like to say that if anybody watching has any burning questions, please put them in the chat. Sanneke will keep an eye on that, and we can ask them either during the talk or at the end. But just coming back to the work, I mean, this kind of like untethered feeling, it reminds me of the sauna scene in Oval, where the main protagonist Anya is speaking about the bodies of others in the sauna space, and she's kind of describing this dichotomy between natural and artificial. And I think you or Anya perfectly describes this weird encounter that Mark Fisher talks about, again, of seeing the outside inside. So maybe we can speak a little bit about the difference between the outside body and the inside body, and maybe a little bit more about where the body kind of comes in, because there's a couple of other works that also are very sort of body heavy, let's say.
Yeah, well, I can talk a bit about that in my fiction, and I think other fiction that deals with contemporary body horror, which I do think is a bit different, because we're aware of the horror of the planetary extinction happening at the same time that we're aware of our own bodies in space. And it's very hard to make connections between those cognitively. And it's also very hard to have physical contact with what we know is happening to the world. Of course, we all make contact with it in different ways, some people more than others, but you can't actually experience climate change. You can only experience the weather, which is something that the theorist Wendy Chun has said that I quote ad nauseum, because it's hard to remind ourselves that, the climate is actually planetary, and we can't access planetary self. So body horror to me today is actually the horror of that discrepancy. Which is to say that there's the sauna scene that you mentioned in my novel, where the character is having this like crisis about like, what size is my body? Who am I in relation to other people? How am I supposed to understand myself in this ecosystem of this microcosm of a sauna at the gym? But then this sort of zooms out frequently in the book, where we're looking at weather patterns, and we're looking at like large interventions in the urban landscape and climate shifts and urban planning shifts, and there's a siren and a honking, sorry. So the idea for me was to sort of deal with the pain and the difficulty of not knowing where your body fits into an ecosystem, meaning what art could you cause that could have a real effect, positively or negatively, What does it mean about yourself now that we understand that bodies themselves are ecosystems that are intimately tied with the environment? When you think about the porosity of the body in relation to, you know, simply pollution, or now everybody understands probiotics and stuff. So we understand that we are multitudes, but what does that mean? How do you go through daily life thinking that? And I do think there are some works in the exhibition that kind of suggest this discrepancy, which I think, yeah, I don't know, maybe there's one we could show.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe Adam Faramawi's makeup tutorial is one, because we kind of watch him parody this makeup and beauty culture scene on YouTube. It was a commission by Channel 4 Randomax, but instead of makeup, he's using paint. So he's kind of going through this process of change, but in a very kind of obvious, very tongue-in-cheek way, I think. But yeah, maybe we can play that one actually. That's Adam Faramawi.
Back to school.
Okay, so now it's time for a full body highlight. I generally do this using shaving foam. Starting at the mouth, extending out over the nose, cheeks, forehead, over the hairline, down over the collarbone, and let's not forget the hands.
Tips for healthy skin and pleasure.
These might not be the most subtle tips, but a lot of us are smoking, including e-cigarettes, not drinking enough water, not sleeping enough, not eating a healthy diet, not working out. Working out is great for your skin because sweating helps your skin purge itself. An awareness and a dedication to bringing pleasure to the body is considered a healing act. I already knew that, so I yanked the flower by its roots. I ran away singing.
Yeah, so as we could see there, Adam was kind of unfolding before our eyes. He's kind of turning into something a little bit alien, maybe a bit more amorphous, a bit more organic in his appearance than before. And he uses his own body and bodies a lot in his work. He really likes to inhabit commercial scenarios, which then take a surreal turn. So in this way, you know, the body inhabits or performs different identities, I guess. So yeah, so I think you know, the positioning of like this incidental that we were kind of talking about earlier, and the incidental encounter is something that we gravitated towards in making this show. You know, how encounters online can often feel random, or encounters with artwork can feel random, like you've stumbled upon something that you maybe weren't looking for. So I think, yeah, in this way, the works perform this sort of disruption. You know, there's a contradiction here, maybe in terms of the intent or agency over delivering a random encounter, because it's kind of similar to the idea of being disrupted when you want to be disrupted. But I guess with that being said, maybe we can talk about like the disruptive nature of the weird, and how this can be a positive or negative disruption, and how that kind of maybe also fits in with this performativity that we've seen in a couple of the works.
Sure. Yeah, I think that one of the most important elements of the exhibition is this disruption of web space, which again reminds me of the way the early internet worked, just because it was so much less governed. So there was a lot of room for glitching and breakage. And a lot of that was really fertile ground for early internet artists to explore. Which was this kind of like, what happens when a link goes wrong? Does it matter? Do we update? And this is also a really big issue for preservation, just not to go off on a tangent, but is it proper to archive a site in its static form, or should it be allowed to degrade like a natural object? And I do think those questions are prescient when it comes to this exhibition, because as you encounter works through like the central hubs, it is hard sometimes to tell what's an artwork. It's hard sometimes to tell who the author is, because there are comment threads. And I find this to be, yes, an important disruption of a lot of a lot of the taken for granted art world stuff, I guess, which was, again, the intent of a lot of early internet artwork, was to disrupt that hierarchical form of presentation and authorship. So I think self-presentation we could also think about as this disruption of authorship, and allowing works to circulate in non-monetizable spaces, or spaces where they can take on a life of their own and become autonomous objects. So I think of that, that meme work, which I really liked. Please remind me the name of it.
It was Kid Xanthrax.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was really enjoyable, and I love the lack of pretension, because yeah, it just it reminds you that none of these systems for producing cultural artifacts are in fact immutable, or, you know, we could actually collectively do something different. And so when you talk about that kind of disconnect or disruption, I think as much about the systems of the art world enshrining objects as I think about the disruption of the internet space, if that makes sense.
I mean, this was one thing that we kind of came to heads with during the installation of the exhibition, let's call it, because Jan Robert and I, we'd gone through all of the works and kind of chosen very specific platforms with which to host them and all of this kind of stuff. And we'd got a show, and then we left it up for a day, and we found that maybe 2 works had been taken down. We'd been banned off a platform because we weren't using it in the correct way. So it is this weird gatekeeping of, I don't know if it's knowledge, I don't know if it's experience, but there's some sort of weird gatekeeping that's now present in a lot of these platforms where, yeah, you can't link out and you can't show certain things, or you get banned from other things. So I think we definitely kind of took this glitching on board. And in fact, the show still glitches. Like, it's been live for 6 weeks, 7 weeks now, and it still glitches. Like, we still have to make adjustments to the run of the exhibition, which is kind of interesting. I think it's, you know, I wonder if this would have been the same maybe in the 90s if we would have tried to make a show like this. I mean, I'm thinking about like Olia Leolina's Trailblazers. Do you know that kind of, that competition that she runs with Dragon Epstein-Child? Like, it's this competition where it's an e-sport basically, which is also super fun, where a group of people come together and they have to get from one web page to another, and they're only allowed to click on the links. So, you know, it's this kind of weird, it's this weird sport where it's the fastest one, it's the fastest person to click within this space. But I think, you know, coming back to the glitch, like, this is a very kind of pertinent topic at the moment, I guess, with Legacy Russell's glitch feminism and all of these ideas around glitching. And of course, everybody's spent so much time online over the last couple of years. Like, we're all super aware that Zoom glitches, sometimes our internet is really bad. So I think we're more accustomed to that now. But yeah, I mean, I guess I was listening to a lot of talks that you gave, Elvia, and you were talking about this, or you're talking about Tom McCarthy's Satin Island and this kind of idea of the holding tank, or like this bug that disrupts and brings the system down. So yeah, I'm thinking about how this relates to the exhibition and how it's been mapped and remapped, as I said, throughout the run. You know, there's been constant maintenance, and I think we had to kind of let go of the idea of how we wanted the show to look, and kind of just keep maintaining it. I don't know, like just to make the works play, essentially. But, you know, this breaking down of links is something that I found to be referred to as link rot, which I think is a really nice turn of phrase, where a link fails to point to its original target, you know, so it kind of renders itself obsolete. So yeah, maybe we can talk about this moment of glitching and kind of how this maybe the glitch is what goes in the gap between something being a weird encounter and something being maybe reality adjacent or real. You know, this moment of glitching. How does this kind of evoke the weird? Does it evoke the weird?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think in the gap, you often find an instance when time is arrested, or those direct connections you imagine to be real are arrested. There's a new book by Jonathan Lethem called The Arrest, which is about, it's a novel about a world where the internet broke and what everyone is doing afterwards. And I like that term, the arrest, so much, because it's like arrested in motion, where suddenly you're in that buffering zone. You're like in a permanent buffer. And that's that term Tom McCarthy uses in his novel Satin Island very frequently to describe the glitch. But the reason he uses the buffer, as he's explained to me, is that the buffer, like the icon that you get when something is buffering, actually has no correlation to the thing that's happening, right? Like if you have also even one of those like loading screens, which is like loading like a bar at the bottom or something, which is supposed to correlate with how much it's loaded, like that's not usually at all related to the amount that the information has loaded. Just as the buffering screen, it isn't really telling you anything. It's a moving icon or a static icon that says wait. But that sort of weird, like it signifies that time is passing or that something is loading, but that's really all it does. It doesn't actually give you information. And I think that that's a really kind of odd and weird moment when you suddenly realize this is an image this is a representation. This isn't actually information about a process that's occurring through code or through something I don't have access to. All it can tell you is that, wait, something's going to happen. Certainly, that's a bit different than a glitch, I think. I wouldn't, that's a design interface that if you look at it a certain way, like say you look at the inside from the outside suddenly, that you realize is quite weird. Whereas a glitch sort of often forces you to face the construct of experience. There's that saying that infrastructure is only noticeable when it breaks. I can't remember somebody had I think I stole that from someone.
I feel like you only notice a pencil's mechanism when it breaks, or you only notice the mechanism of a pen when it breaks or something.
Yeah, in regards to infrastructure space, it's like the Wi-Fi router is a good example, because you rarely think about your router except when your internet is slow.
Right.
And infrastructure is that stuff behind the walls, like the plumbing, the electricity, and the Wi-Fi, in the air. Like, how do we imagine these things working? And when they glitch or break, we suddenly think about the fact that infrastructure space is all around us, and that it's actually very designed to be invisible, I guess. Mm-hmm. So glitches are important online and off. I think and I do think, we could talk about glitch feminism a bit. I do think that we think we touched on there being like a feminist aspect to weirdness. I would say potential feminist. There are a lot of ways you could replace the word weirdness with queering, and in certain kinds of like gender studies contexts, I think that might make sense, which just means to take a non-normative take on a set of social constructs and to look at them through the lens of an formerly othered experience, and sort of to center a different experience and subjectivity, which I think, the idea of glitching can also potentially do.
Yeah, what you were saying there kind of reminds me of this talk that you gave called Death by Landscape, the Weird Outside, which of course is the name of your new book coming out, but the title's taken from this Margaret Atwood story. So yeah, this 1990s story of the same name, it's told from the perspective of this surviving woman who decades later realizes, she's obsessing over these landscape paintings, right, in her house, and she's kind of saying how they open inward onto a wall, not like windows, but like doors. So she's kind of thinking of them as being maybe portals to another world. So yeah, well, eventually, I guess, you can probably describe it much better than I can, but she sees her lost friend in these paintings, like her dead friend. She sees her in these paintings, and I think in the end, maybe the paintings become her, or she becomes the paintings. But I think what's really nice about that story is that the death at the center of that story is actually not a death at all. But I think you kind of framed it as being like this twin becoming of girl and plant, and I think that's also something that you touched on in that essay that I mentioned at the beginning, you know, this kind of these multiple instances in science fiction, in science fiction film, science fiction literature, where there is a very heavy sort of feminine presence, but it's also very much linked with nature. So this kind of like merging of figure and landscape, and then this kind of, again, another perception flip, which I think I see in Adam's work quite a lot. I mean, Adam is male identifying, but you know, he's kind of parodying this predominantly female authored space of makeup tutorials. So he's already adopting a persona, I guess. So I think maybe the question here is like, do we see this transformation of like female and nature as being inherently weird? Because I know that, you know, you mentioned Annihilation, both the film and the book, and also there's a couple of other stories as well that you mentioned where women become nature and that kind of thing. So is this rebirth into nature a death, or is it weird? Is this invocation of weirdness even valuable? Like, how do you kind of position that thinking of woman becoming nature, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
I've got another loud truck, excuse me. I don't think there's anything inherently feminist about any story, depending on how, or any narrative, let's say. So woman becoming landscape is, in many ways, could be seen as a typical woman as nature, man as culture kind of divide, where women go back to the land, women commune with the fertile natural ground, and as Donna Haraway would say, women become another natural resource to be exploited. So this connection of the feminine and the natural is tricky. It's not something I want to like be a proponent of in general. What I'm interested in are stories that do this, that suggest a becoming of woman and landscape or plant or non-human entity ecosystem, that are, it's just extremely loud on my street, that are able to suggest this as either deliberate, like a deliberate transformation that is actually a reclaiming of something, and an acceptance of change as part of life, or as something really joyful. So that this would not be like a subjugation narrative, but this would be like a pretty pleasurable, exciting becoming something that isn't human. And that it would go both ways. So some of the stories I talk about, like Karen Russell wrote a short story called The Bad Graft, which is partially told from the perspective of a plant that enters a woman through, it accidentally inseminates her through a little thorn. So I'm just as curious about what it would feel like for non-humans to become part of us as the other way around. So again, that's kind of moving. I'm using these stories to think about moving beyond this idea of woman becoming or woman being penetrated to the idea of human becoming or human being penetrated by the outside world, and how this could actually be seen as a form of labor that anybody could take on or learn to share the labor of reproduction, which is to become plant. I mean, not to zoom out too much, but the life cycle does mean sort of like, there is a return to the earth and also a fertilizing of the earth. And always, breathing is a part of creating an atmosphere. Shitting is a part of creating the atmosphere. Dying is part of creating the atmosphere. All of these processes could be seen as world making, and we could step away from quote unquote natural reproduction to think about world making in that way. But I feel like I've strayed from some of the digital space that we were talking about. So I guess I would just want to talk about some ways that that internet digital culture is naturalized and treated again as a landscape that is the backdrop for human actors versus a landscape that we are all co-creating voluntarily through labor, whether or not we like it. There is like an aspect of co-creating the spaces that we inhabit, and thinking about, I would like to think about ways that we could do that work differently.
I mean, I think what you were saying about nature, landscape, and these kinds of things. I mean, it's something that I noticed a lot in Oval, like the Anya and Lewis kind of live on this ecological mountain called, I think it's called the Berg, right? And their whole house is like this eco house, and towards the end there's some weird stuff happening with cartilage architecture and houses and these kinds of things, and I think that's very much tied to technology, which of course is tied to the digital. But I guess maybe thinking about that and thinking about the world that you created, or the kind of like reality adjacent world that you created in Oval, maybe it will be a nice segue to talk about some other works in the show that also do this very similar thing of worlding or kind of parodying fiction or fairy tales. So one of the works that I've loved having in the show is Cassie McQuater's feminist dungeon crawler game called Banshee. We've actually got one level of it in the show, but it's such a great game, and I think it really kind of shifts that focus of a very male-dominated space in the 80s of like these very early graphics games to being something that's very, maybe not pro-female, but definitely kind of from a female identifying perspective, which I think is super important, especially in that space. So I think maybe, Jose, if we can take a look at Cassie McQuater's Banshee real quick. Yeah, so maybe with Cassie's work in mind, we can talk about this outside space that we've been coming back to a lot, and its relation to the digital, or like these new digital movements of virtual reality or role-playing games, and how that kind of also interjects with persona creation and worlding, for want of a better word.
Sure. I mean, we could definitely talk about that in terms of gaming or the gamification of self, which cuts both ways. I do think the gamification of self is what leads us to self-help Instagram and kind of constant performativity of optimization and endless to-do list apps and workout apps, et cetera, et cetera. But then there is this kind of lingering gamification of the internet, which I think your exhibition brings to the surface, which is the simple fun of exploration that can happen in digital space, and a kind of gamification which is maybe like latent or simmering in the world of hyperlinks. There's still a thrill I think I get from following links down rabbit holes. I think it's still exciting. I was playing this Wikipedia game the other day where you have to get to, apparently you can get to philosophy on Wikipedia if you click the first 9 links that you come across on each page. And I was just thinking, like, what a miracle. This is really, there's something miraculous about this. And it still feels like there is exploration to be had amongst the cracks. And on like message boards and stuff, which is where some of the work is enacted in the show. Those are actually, I think, some of the most lively places where people can kind of go wild, which are incidentally mostly text-based spaces. But thinking about, we'd also think about gamification in terms of the performativity of the self, in terms of like what it means to play a role online, and how I mentioned earlier this odd gap between the body and the identity people choose to inhabit, which often looks like the same as the self on the driver's license or the ID card, but it might actually be very different. It's always jarring when you meet someone in person who you know online and they're totally different than you expected. Yeah. So in very small ways, this performativity can happen, but also in very creative and exciting ways that are very generative, and also sort of enter the self into this sphere where other selves are role-playing. Again, role-playing was really popular on the early internet. That was one of the best ways people had to interact in virtual worlds. Now, I guess you see that mostly in like video gaming, which I also think offers like a huge realm for creativity and like discourse even in game worlds. Although I know less about digital gaming worlds than I know about offline physical gaming worlds. So I don't know if I can speak to them too much.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting, like, especially on Fortnite and stuff, where you can have an identity, you can create any identity you want, but you got to be prepared to pay for it, because you got to pay for the skins, you got to pay for all of these kinds of different things. And I think that was something that, I mean, I guess it was prevalent in Second Life. You know, you had to buy your plot of land and these kinds of things, but I feel like now it's maybe much more about commercialization of like skins or of names or of these kinds of things, and kind of really trying to sell them to younger viewers who are just kind of like taking my mum and dad's card or whatever. But yeah, I mean, for sure, like this idea of kind of adopting personalities online, I think it's because you can hide behind the screen. The screen is the mediator between yourself and your audience. So you can, yeah, it's liberating. I think it's liberating. And I think a lot of the artists in the show are kind of, they're also playing to this idea. And I think Jan, Robert and myself also play to this idea, because none of the works in the show have the context of art around them. They don't have any signs or signifiers as being artworks, right? So they have like these randomly assigned usernames and these kinds of things. And the only way that you can actually know what a work is if you enter the exhibition via the direct download for a start, and you get a copy of the booklet, and you can kind of see people's works in the booklet. I think for us it was really important to kind of have that separation, because I think that separation allows for more people to maybe have, I don't want to say more genuine experiences with the work, but I think if you're just kind of stumbling upon a work in the show, I mean, it happened on one of the works. We've got Casey Kaufman's collage work on 9gag, which I'm sure Jose can bring up in a sec, but you know, it's kind of this work, we put it up there maybe a month before the show launched, and we already had like 3 or 4 comments before the exhibition went live of people just being like, what the fuck is this? Like, I do not understand what this is. And kind of just it being adopted and being part of the internet language. Like, people were posting memes about it in the comment section. And I think that was really interesting for me to see that, because these were people that did not know what the show was. The show wasn't complete by then, so there wasn't a link to kind of progress. It just kind of existed on 9gag. And I think that's really special. I think it kind of points to what you were saying about you know, still being able to go down these weird internet rabbit holes. I mean, Sam, the guy that we work with, Sam sent me so many weird sites that I had no idea that existed, of course, because there are millions of websites. But you know, these websites like stinkymeat.com, which is just this guy posting photos of like bits of meat that he finds. Like, you know, I think the internet can be this space for like every single thing, and I think that's super exciting. But yeah, Jose, maybe you want to show Casey's collage work if you have it quickly.
One thing I think about when looking at these like mysterious or like little known corners of the internet that when you enter them turn out to be like super popular is the experience that I had when I first started learning code, I guess also learning how to navigate the internet sort of like organically. But when, I guess in the mid 2000s, 2010s, I learned to do basic coding, like really basic HTML, CSS, PHP, MySQL, things nobody uses anymore. And I was so struck by how these early coding languages and really like the most basic substrates of a lot of the internet really last longer than a lot of the like, you know, everyone knows like Flash is a terrible idea, but like things that emerged later on and things that are much more popular now, they break a lot more often. They're more likely to fall offline. Languages change more quickly, so things become obsolete way more quickly. I have a friend named J.R. Carpenter, who's an electronic literature master and has been making code poetry since like, I guess the 90s, maybe earlier. And
Wow.
she calls HTML the cockroach of the medium, just like zines, like where zines will inherit the earth because they will live longer than any kind of high literature form, similar to these like really robust basic HTML hard-coded pages with leaks. So I've always, when like making things online, I've always been really attentive to, for instance, Olia Lialina has like a guidebook for how to make proper websites that she wrote like 20 years ago. And like one time I made a website and she wrote me and she was like, "You've made something that is not a hyperlink blue. I need you to change this." And I was like, she's totally right. Like, why would we lose this like common visual language? It's so basic. And I do think like I'm always interested in returning to those basic building blocks of the internet, which I think actually allow a profound weirdness to emerge as much as anything else that's complicated. And one thing I really like about these, like, I guess sort of like the descendants of like bulletin boards, like those meme pages or like 9gag that we were just looking at, is that they really do feel like robust and long lasting forms of stuff. Like while the images themselves might degrade or disappear, that conversation is likely to stand for a really long time. And I really like this like record of a time that you can access in that way. And a lot of it, I mean, just the form of a conversation or like a thread does become like an interesting kind of time travel where you can follow something all the way back. And that is very different from other kinds of time experience. That's like a very specific temporal mechanism.
I had a question as well about I think I was thinking about what a weird encounter often is. It's very much in the now. It's these disruptions are very sort of in outside, exactly, body and outside. They're sort of now, they break with every conception of norm. So they're very performative. They're not frozen, but they're dynamic. So it's a moment evolving. It's very and as soon as you don't do that, as soon as you recollect, you start putting locks on everything, you sort of fall back into this normalization of life, and you can do it on a social level or personal level. And I always found computers very much to be like beautifully analogous to life, because they're also performing machines, and they're sort of staging this sort of quaint solidity, but actually that's why the glitch is so nice, because it sort of breaks that illusion, and you sort of see the performative machine sort of stumbling, and that was so great about the 90s. It was such a free, open place. I think that's I totally get the nostalgia. So what I wanted to say is I'm super curious to hear you about, because it's very frustrating to see how the net has been platformed, which is really solidifying this space, this performative space. It's all about content, but this ontological space of the computer space is very much restricted by boxes, and these boxes are becoming more and more narrow and less. And the latest step, of course, has been the immutability of the NFT space. So now we're making boxes which will last forever, and they're even more solid. It feels even more boxed, and the performativity is even being killed. So it's now, they're sort of little diamonds set and unmutable, which feels so paradoxical with what the machine is, but also in a way what life is and where weird was, the weird moment. I don't know. I find it difficult to get that. I don't know what your vision, maybe you have some wonderful insights.
I can't promise wonderful insights, but I did think of a lot of things while you were speaking. I do think this like frozen NFT object is a sorry end. I hope, and I'm also sure that it is not the end point, because artists and everyone will continue to make things that don't make sense within these categories and within these systems of commodification. And I think that's already happening. I mean, right now, I think we're in a kind of a gamification phase where people are trying to make the system work in their favor, you know, all the best to them, like that has to happen. But I think soon we will enter a phase where things get way weirder. And if people do things with NFTs that we're not expecting, undercut their authority, probably find ways to make entirely new blockchain systems that are communally owned by artists, for instance, which was something that we dreamed of in the mid 2000s. I remember I remember having a lot of conversations about, could we make an NFT that was like an artist's social security system? Like, could we all contribute to like a blockchain for communally owned art? And there were lots of ideas that sort of fizzled because people didn't have the resources to put behind them. Of course, the people with resources to put behind them would rather invest in a static object NFT. So, you know, there is, as always, a gap between the dream and what became realized. But I do think now that a lot of these technologies are in place and the protocols are solidified, I hope and think that there will be room to nudge them and upend their authority in this way. And whoever is making a living off it right now, like, I hope that is good and continues for them. but we also have to remember that most people will not benefit from this. Like, most creators will not. It is not a democratizing situation. It's a consolidation of wealth. And that is, it's not what there was potential for. So I don't actually think it's a retrogressive or a romantic nostalgia to look back at earlier phases of the internet. I don't think I'm glorifying what that space was. There were also a lot of awful things that happened to people in early internet spaces. But I do think looking back at what was possible because the medium was less technologically advanced and less commodified, and what it could have afforded earlier on is actually a very, it's a utopian gesture, but it's also a practical one. There are really things that we could pick up on. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot lately is natural language processing. So like GPT-3, like this pretty advanced tool for generating what appears to humans like pretty natural language with a lot of problems. Like, it's certainly not perfect, but it can respond to questions. It can learn about what you sound like and then imitate your speech patterns. It can write a new Shakespeare sonnet, this sort of thing. So there's a lot of discourse about computers beginning to talk back to us. And I think that there's also a super potential for weirdness there when we think about actually listening to what the computer has to say instead of trying to force it to imitate human language, and also allowing it to do things that are not useful for us, allowing it to be creative on its own terms. And then I also am just really interested in this idea that computers are talking to each other all the time in a way that humans have no access to, which is profoundly weird. That there is some, you know, like if you have a smartphone and a smart fridge, they are probably in communication all the time, unbeknownst to you, and you wouldn't be able to read their language. So I think there's also this thing about language that is not for people, that is not for us, which of course you can reverse and look at, you know, go back to the idea of landscape and look at plant communication. It's not for us. We can't actually interpret what plants are saying. We can't speak their language, but we can be fairly sure that they're communicating. I did take that far from your question, but it was very generative.
Sanneke, anything up on the online?
No, nothing happening. I was just wonderfully thinking of Steiner when you talked of this last bit of like using the computer in unpredictable ways. And there's an interview in which she says that she wanted to build a software that had always an unpredictable outcome, and no one wanted to help her build it because everyone was like, why should we do that? So it's so fascinating how this poetry is so beautifully embedded in her practice. And I think Jan Robert and I always come back to the Versuchers at one point. But no, nothing happening online. People, don't be shy. Elvia is still here for not all too long, so hurry up.
Yeah, feel free to ask questions.
There was a thing that I wanted to maybe also involve Jan Robert in answering this question, and this is if this freedom of anonymity and building your own identity that we found in the early web is maybe now happening more in game environments, since you're very knowledgeable on the early web, but also on games in general, also of contemporary games. Do you see a possibility there of reclaiming identity and playing creatively with identity in a less restrictive way?
Me?
Yeah, you're
I'm not completely, I was never a big gamer. So it's not my expertise. I'm more interested in the, I would say more the surroundings in games, the space and the materials. So I was never really into the identity aspect of it. There's way better artists, fascinating things.
Not in your practice, but in your knowledge of games that you happen to have quite a lot. But maybe they're also always tending, now that I rethink of the games that we spoke of, to the more architectural side than the but even that maybe like what's his name, the game that you can be everything is actually maybe a good example of it, because that is actually being nice one of shifting identity, becoming a planet, becoming an object. That's a very helpful one. And games are super good at that. So I agree with Elvia. There's still so much space there. And I think it is. I mean, it's such an. If anything, it's the simulation engine. So it's a wonderful place for high weirdness if you go into the game spaces, and the thing can be simulated, and the perspectives and everything is warpable. So it is, it's an incredible space. And of course, the normative culture there is so heavy because of the big bucks going around and the traditional sort of teenage boy heavy audience. And there's good steps being done, but there's so much still to be done. And that's immaculate. So expect a lot to come from there.
There's definitely like I've noticed a lot with younger artists, like this need to create games or be involved in making collaborative games, and I don't really know where that comes from. Maybe it just comes from like the community, the communal social kind of aspect of gaming. But I think, just to go back to your point about like identity within gaming, I don't play a lot of games either, but the games that I do play tend to be kind of simulation games. So when I was younger, I would play Grand Theft Auto, but I wouldn't play it like how they wanted you to play it. And I think a lot of people actually don't, they kind of find ways to play it that suits them. And I'm wondering if actually the more we play a game, the more we kind of play a character. It doesn't matter if that character looks like us or not. It doesn't matter if we've chosen that character or not. I feel like we become that character. Like I also play Stardew Valley, and I got to choose my character, but the way that I run my farm and the way that I like go down in the mines, like it's how I would do it. Like I don't know, I'm just trying to think about like if it really matters if you get to choose what you look like, or if like just even playing through, like going through the motions of playing a game really allows you to become that character and kind of adopt that persona. And maybe there's something weird in that, right?
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, it's fine. Okay, I can. I'll do it. I think there are different kinds of games. So I do think that the idea of landscape is actually really important in a lot of games, and a lot of people do play them for the beauty and the immersive experience of being part of a landscape that isn't our own. We could talk a lot about VR in those terms. Yeah, for instance, I played the Spider-Man game, which was really just about this incredible rendering of Manhattan rather than collecting points. Just like exploring that and like flying through it was amazing. But when we're talking about like social networks and gamification in that way, it makes more sense to talk about stuff like World of Warcraft, where people really do talk to each other, form teams, do a lot of crazy cooperative stuff, where social dynamics are really present, and people do often not tell the exact truth about who they are, or where they are, or what they're doing. And I guess that would, for me, be more of like a legacy descendant of like early role-playing games online. But it is more complicated when your real voice or your real location are involved. And in those games, there are also higher stakes, I think, to what avatar you choose, because you can clearly have some discrepancy. But I think artists are using the idea of game space exactly as you say, because of the desire to create social spaces of play that really can't be ultimately commodified, and also to think about the way that social worlds affect art worlds and other worlds. So the group that produces the game is sort of inherent to the game, because the players can't be separated from the characters, and the game design is kind of part and parcel of the ethics of what happens in the game. So to me, that drive towards gamification is a drive towards community and sociality, but also a drive towards discussing the ethics of what it means to make stuff in outside spaces, weird spaces, which art can still allow, I think.
That reminds me, when you were talking about that, about your research or your interest in the artist placement group, and kind of why artists are maybe bought in or co-opted by companies, and who are they producing for. I think in one of your talks you mentioned, like, or John Latham mentions this like third invisible actor in this, which is not the artist, it's not the company, it's just invisible person that maybe we now associate with being the audience. So maybe you want to speak a little bit about that, because I remember finding that super interesting. I mean, I'm from the UK, but John Latham wasn't really an artist that I knew so much about, and especially this artist placement group, it seems to me quite radical. It's quite a radical thing to do in the 60s, to place artists within groups like this.
Yeah, so what the artist placement group did in the 60s and 70s, and maybe onward, depending on how you define their practice, was to pick artists and put them in context of corporations or industries and have them produce something. But their rule was that it couldn't be for the benefit of the artist or for the industry. So it had to be completely non-beneficial for anyone. And so there was this kind of Venn diagram that emerges when thinking about the client here, where it's not the artist, it's not the corporation or whatever, it's this invisible third person who John Latham, who's one of the protagonists of this group, calls like the invisible third person, but has often been called the public or the audience. And so in this text you're referencing, I'm trying to figure out who that invisible third person could be today. Like, do we think that the public exists as such? Do we think that humans should even exist as such? Really like questioning that Venn diagram, which I think is still extremely useful, because the other experiments that combined art and industry, art and technology, art and corporations that happened throughout the 70s, 80s, especially in California, like art and technology, or experiments in art and technology, which were two different groups, which put artists like Robert Irwin or Rauschenberg or Warhol, they stuck them to NASA, or they stuck them to like the Rand Corporation, and they said, make something awesome, which clearly had clients. Like, they wanted to produce value for the corporation, and they wanted to produce value for the artists, their careers in the art world. And it seems to me that a lot of the time the invisible third client got lost. Sometimes it was kind of remained, because the output that they imagined was a conversational, experiential output rather than making something. But this is really an important topic today, I think, because the amount of artists embedded not just in corporations, but in tech corporations, thinking about artists' effects on digital space is pretty frequent. I mean, the idea of having an artist in residence or an artist consulting or an artist hanging around and doing something with Google, with MIT, whatever, Facebook, and, you know, Autodesk, they all have artist in residence programs. So I think it's probably not like artists tend to talk about this stuff as like fringe to their career, but I think it's becoming more central, which means interesting things for digital space or not, depending on how powerful you think the artist is in that context.
Was something very, oh no, go ahead, Rebecca, I think you have something popping up. But that might be a very conclusive question. So maybe I'm too early. Anything still bubbling here? No, because
I'm sure we can tack on to your conclusive question.
Yeah. Which is, but you can also say no, but I was really curious sort of, so yeah, the elements of the new weird, or what was your motivation to write your upcoming book? Is there anything you want to tell us about it?
Oh, that's a kind question, and also a cruel question. Yeah, so the book is called Death by Landscape. So it was inspired by, or began with, a talk that has been referenced a couple times about becoming plants, and sort of also thinking about self-death, world death, planetary death, extinction, as trying to reframe things as a becoming, rather than either like reverting to a pre-Anthropocene moment when everything was fine, or fast forwarding to a post-human future when everything is different and it's a space opera, and really trying to be here and now during the process of extinction, and trying to imagine ways that the world is transforming for the better and the worse, and not just see it as a death or an endpoint. Yeah, the rest of the book, it deals with plants a lot, plant language, computer language on opposite ends of the spectrum. It deals with this idea of extinction, both grand and personal. So I deal a lot with trauma and trauma discourse, because there's this term in trauma discourse, extinction burst, which is a last burst of post-traumatic response that happens right before you move past it, which I find really interesting, kind of in relation to the way that we talk about the planetary. And then I end a lot talking about games, actually, and live action role play, and sort of like being reborn through the process of a game. So lots of things we talked about.
Yeah, exactly. It's everything we talked about. Perfect. Can't wait. So when is it coming out? Next year?
Yeah, next year. Gotta wait like, I don't know, 9-10 months.
Yeah. I can't wait. It sounds really good.
Thank you. Sanneke, I feel like we cut you off many times.
No, it's totally fine. I just think it was indeed quite a conclusive question, and I think it's rounds it nicely up. So I think this might be the moment to have a last look at the chats, both on Vimeo and YouTube, but no one seems to dare.
Okay. I guess...
Well, maybe we can finish with one of, I think, the best works in the show in terms of how it was displayed, because this was an incredibly long process of getting this work to kind of look how the artist wanted it to look and to kind of go with the concept that the artist had. And that is Nikolai Schmelling's work. So Nikolai's work is hosted on Jitsi, and when you access it, if you like toggle the gallery view, you can see 3 instances of a video work that are playing at different moments, and this directly mimics Nikolai's kind of conception of the work in real space. So it is really this blurring of IRL and URL, I guess. And I think it was a very interesting part. I think it is a very interesting work for the show in the way that it kind of takes you through this disembodied viewing experience. So maybe we can end by showing that. But I just wanted to thank Elvia so much for taking the time and kind of being part of this really interesting conversation around the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a joy to speak with you.
Great.
Yeah,
Thank you,
so
Lima.
much. Thank you, arebyte. It was a great pleasure doing this 2 programs with you. And so for everyone at home, don't forget to watch the show if you didn't do it yet. So go there before September 6th, I think it was. And I think there's actually a new show coming up in the gallery already tomorrow.
Yeah, we have a new show, a new physical show opening tomorrow. It's called Software for Less, and it's a solo show by American artist Ben Grosser. So we've commissioned 4 new works, as well as showing a whole range of his other software works as well. So if you're in London, do pop by. We're open from 6 tomorrow.
I wish I could see it. Well, thanks so much, everyone. And I think we just say bye and leave everyone at home with the last piece of the night. So thank you all and see you next time.